Hello, dear friends. Today I want to talk to you about something that troubles each of us, but about which we often fear to speak aloud, about the feelings that come after the loss of a loved one, especially about that moment when we ask ourselves, am I mourning my beloved enough? Does the soul of my loved one feel my sorrow and love? Recently, I spoke with Marta, a woman who lost her husband a few months ago. After 60 years of life together, she was left alone. You know, Marta said to me, looking out the window of her living room, I can't cry like others do. Sometimes I just sit in his chair and talk to him as if he were still here, but I hardly cry. I feel like I am betraying him by doing this. Does his soul feel that I still love him if I don't weep every day? This conversation made me reflect on the fact that many of us carry similar fears within us. We fear that we are not expressing our grief loudly enough, that our loved ones, who have departed to another world, may not feel our love because we do not follow the usual mourning rituals. We worry that perhaps their souls are lonely there because we do not show proper grief here. This feeling is especially familiar to people of our generation. We grew up with certain ideas about how we should say goodbye to our loved ones. Black clothing, tears, formal rituals. But what if a person's soul sees and feels much deeper than these external manifestations? Today, we will together try to look behind the curtain of this deep question. We will discuss what may happen to a person's soul after their departure. We will consider various aspects of this issue that concerns many of us, especially as we reach an age where losses become a part of our lives. I invite you to this difficult but important journey of reflection on the connection that transcends the boundary between worlds. Let's start by trying to formulate the question that lies before us. What actually happens to a person's soul if they are not mourned in the way society deems appropriate? Does the soul feel loneliness or resentment if loved ones do not show outward signs of grief? Is it forced to wander between worlds in search of comfort? These questions have their roots in humanity's oldest beliefs about the afterlife. Consider how different cultures relate to the process of saying goodbye. In some traditions, the relatives must mourn the deceased loudly, otherwise their soul may not find peace. In others, on the contrary, excessive mourning is considered an obstacle for the soul, which must transition freely to another world. For example, in Mexico, the Day of the Dead is still celebrated, where families host vibrant festivities with altars decorated with photos of deceased relatives, their favorite dishes, and marigold flowers. This is not a time of sorrow, but a time of reunion and joy. In some regions of Colombia and Ecuador, funeral processions are accompanied by music and even dancing, symbolizing the liberation of the soul. At the same time, many Spanish-speaking countries have strict mourning traditions. In some families, widows wear black for years, and relatives avoid celebrations. These conflicting cultural messages cause many to feel guilty when their personal experience of grief does not match societal expectations. This is where the internal conflict arises. Señora Gonzalez from Puerto Rico told me that after her husband's death, she felt the disapproving gazes of neighbors when she returned to her usual gardening activities a month later. They thought I wasn't grieving enough, she said. But I simply found comfort in doing what my Carlos always loved, taking care of our flowers. Perhaps we should reflect on the fact that the true connection between the living and the departed is not measured by the loudness of tears or the darkness of clothing. Maybe this connection exists in a completely different plane, inaccessible to external observers, but very real for the soul. Many spiritual traditions in our world speak of how, after death, the soul is freed from earthly cares and limitations. It is no longer bound by physical needs and emotional attachments as it was while in the body. What we consider important from a worldly perspective may hold a completely different significance for the soul. I want to share with you the story of Juan from Chile. During a heart operation, he experienced clinical death for nearly 4 minutes. Upon returning to life, Juan recounted, I felt such peace, such freedom. It was as if all the heavy feelings stayed below, and I was floating above them. I felt no resentment, no fear, not even worry for those I was leaving behind. There was only understanding and love that requires no proof. This experience of Juan resonates with what many people who have gone through something similar describe. They talk about a state in which earthly cares and expectations lose their significance. The soul seems to gain a broader perspective on things. And if this is the case, perhaps it is not so important to the soul how many tears have been shed over its earthly shell, or how many days the loved ones wear mourning clothes. In ancient Mayan beliefs, there is a notion that the soul goes through several stages of purification after death, before it reaches its final place of rest. In this process, it does not matter how the living grieve. What matters is how the person lived their life and what deeds they performed. Similar ideas can be found in many spiritual traditions around the world. Senora Maria from Argentina, who lost her daughter in a car accident, shared, "In the first months, I couldn't stop crying. I thought that if I stopped grieving, I would betray her memory. But one night, I saw her in a dream. She looked so happy, so light. She said to me, 'Mom, your tears are like chains for me. Let me go with love.' From that day on, I started seeking joy in my memories of her, instead of drowning in tears." Perhaps our traditional notions of grief are more related to our own needs than to the needs of the souls that have departed. Maybe for souls, what matters more is not the outward expressions of sorrow, but the inner connection of love that does not sever with the death of the body. If the soul truly frees itself from earthly limitations, then perhaps the connection with it is established not through tears and rituals. Many people who have experienced the loss of loved ones speak of feeling their presence in entirely different ways, through unexpected signs, dreams, or simply an unexplainable sense of closeness at certain moments. Listen to the story of Elena from Venezuela. When her mother passed away, Elena couldn't attend the funeral due to illness. For years, she tormented herself with feelings of guilt. "I couldn't say goodbye to her. I couldn't mourn her properly," Elena recounted. "But on the day my daughter got married, I felt my mom's presence so strongly beside me, as if she were standing behind me, her hands on my shoulders. I even caught the scent of her favorite perfume. At that moment, I realized that my mom had always been with me, despite the fact that I couldn't see her off in her final journey." Psychologists call this continuing bonds, relationships that do not end with death, but simply change their form. It is like an invisible bridge between worlds, built not from rituals and traditions, but from love, memory, and spiritual closeness. In Spanish-speaking cultures, this idea is reflected in various traditions. For example, in some regions of Peru and Bolivia, there's a custom of talking to photographs of deceased relatives, sharing news with them, and seeking their advice. This is not considered strange or painful. It is a natural way to maintain a connection. Antonio, an elderly Mexican man, greets the photograph of his wife, who passed away 10 years ago every morning. "Good morning, my Consuelo. Today I will go to the park where we love to walk." He does not cry, does not wear mourning clothing, but his bond with his wife lives on in these simple daily rituals. Perhaps it is these quiet, personal moments of connection that mean much more to the soul than loud public displays of grief. Maybe the soul hears not so much our words or tears, but the movements of our heart. It feels not the external manifestations of sorrow, but our love, which continues despite the boundary that separates us between worlds. And then the question, what does the soul feel if it is not mourned, receives a completely different answer. Perhaps the soul feels not the absence of tears, but the presence of love, which finds its own special, often very quiet ways of expression. Each person goes through their own unique path of grief. What brings comfort to one may seem empty or meaningless to another. And that is normal. Perhaps the souls of people, like the individuals themselves, are completely unique in their experience of transition. The story of Miguel from Colombia illustrates this well. When his father passed away, Miguel couldn't cry at the funeral. He stood there as if frozen, while his sisters and mother wept, feeling guilty that he couldn't express his grief as openly. Everyone looked at him as if he were an insensitive person, Miguel recalled later. But a month after the funeral, he went to the coast, where he and his father often went fishing. There, alone with the ocean, he finally broke down. He talked to his father, shouted, cried, laughed, recalling their fishing trips. It was his way of saying goodbye, and he is sure that his father understood him. There are many such stories. Diego from Argentina couldn't visit his mother's grave, but he wrote a cookbook based on her recipes and felt her presence every time he cooked from it. Lucia from Chile continued her brother's work, volunteering at an animal shelter and said she saw her brother's grateful gaze in the eyes of every rescued dog. Psychologists today acknowledge that there is no right or wrong way to grieve. Some people indeed need abundant tears and open expressions of sorrow. Others find more comfort in quiet reflection or practical actions related to the memory of the deceased. A third group finds solace in continuing the work that was important to their loved one. And if we accept this individuality in the experience of grief for the living, why not allow the same individuality for the souls that have departed? Perhaps each soul perceives in its own way how it is remembered on earth. For one, certain rituals may be important, while for another it may be the continuation of their work, or simply a peaceful acceptance of their departure. What if souls do not see the outward manifestations, but rather the essence of the feelings of the living? What if they are able to penetrate the mask of social politeness or public expectations and see the true love that can exist even without tears? Cultural differences in relation to death and mourning are like a multicolored mosaic, where each fragment reflects a unique human experience. In different corners of the Spanish-speaking world, these traditions take on a special color, often mixing ancient beliefs with Catholic rituals. In Mexico, for example, the Day of the Dead turns the memory of those who have passed into a vibrant celebration with music, food, and colorful altars. For Mexicans, death is not an end, but a continuation of life in another dimension, and the souls of the deceased joyfully return to visit the living. The traditions are quite different in some mountainous areas of Peru, where mourning can last for years, and widows wear black for the rest of their lives. The story of Susana from Miami illustrates how people often find themselves caught between traditions. Her parents were from Cuba, but she grew up in the United States. When her grandmother died, the family faced a conflict of expectations. The older generation insisted on a long novena with crowded vigils, while the American relatives considered it excessive. Susana felt torn between two worlds, her loved ones recount. In the end, she found her way by combining elements of both traditions. During the day, she participated in prayers with the Cuban side of the family, and in the evenings, she shared stories about her grandmother with the American relatives, remembering her with a smile. Cultural expectations can become a heavy burden for the grieving. In some communities, a person who does not show sufficient outward signs of grief may be considered disrespectful or even suspicious. This is especially true for women, who are often expected to have more emotional reactions. Men, on the other hand, face pressure to be strong and not show tears. But what do the souls of the departed themselves feel while observing these cultural contradictions? Anthropologist Ramon Gutierrez, who studied attitudes towards death in different cultures, suggests, if we accept the idea that souls gain a broader understanding after death, it is logical to assume that they see the limitations of any human traditions. Perhaps they watch with tenderness and understanding as their loved ones attempt to follow cultural norms, but at the same time, they value the sincerity of feelings much more than conformity to customs. And indeed, what could be more important for the soul? The formal adherence to rituals, or a sincere, albeit quiet and unnoticed by others, maintenance of the bond of love? Many people who have experienced the loss of loved ones describe inexplicable phenomena that they perceive as signs of an ongoing connection. These stories are so prevalent across different cultures that they prompt us to consider, perhaps our interaction with those who have passed does not end, but merely changes form. Consuelo from Puerto Rico shared her story. A week after her husband Raul's death, she woke up to the smell of coffee. It was strange since no one was home, she recalls. I went into the kitchen and saw that the coffee maker was on. That's how Raul made coffee for me every morning for 30 years. I didn't remember turning it on the night before. At that moment, I felt he was saying to me, I am still here, taking care of you. Researchers of paranormal phenomena have gathered thousands of similar testimonies. These can include unexplained scents associated with the deceased, a feeling of presence, strange coincidences, unusually vivid dreams, melodies that suddenly start playing for no apparent reason. Roberto from Ecuador suffered for several months from feelings of guilt after the death of his brother Manuel. They had quarreled shortly before his death in a car accident, and Roberto hadn't had the chance to apologize. He couldn't sleep at night, constantly cried, his family recounts. But one day he dreamed of Manuel, who said, "Enough, brother. I hold no grudges against you. Move on." Roberto woke up feeling as if a huge weight had lifted from his shoulders. From that day on, he gradually began to return to normal life. Psychologists often explain such phenomena as the workings of the subconscious, which helps us find comfort. However, many spiritual traditions offer a different explanation. Perhaps the connection between souls truly continues after physical death. Interestingly, people who have experienced clinical death often recount that during their time there, they could feel the emotions of their loved ones. Dr. Martinez, who studied near-death experiences in Barcelona, provides testimonies. Many patients say they could sense the love and worry of their relatives who were in the hospital. In this context, the physical manifestations of grief, tears, cries, seemed less significant to them than the feelings themselves. This leads to thoughts about the bidirectional nature of the connection between worlds. Perhaps we are not the only ones seeking ways to connect with departed souls. They may also find ways to let us know of their presence and care. So what can be said about what the soul feels if it is not mourned in a traditional way? Perhaps the answer is much deeper and more comforting than many think. The ancient wisdom of many cultures and modern research on near-death experiences suggest one thing. After leaving the body, the soul likely gains a broader understanding and is freed from many earthly limitations. It sees not only the external manifestations of grief, but also the essence of the feelings that connect it to its loved ones. Jose, a priest from a small parish in Puerto Rico, has listened to thousands of confessions from the grieving throughout his long practice. He says, "Love is an energy that does not disappear with the death of the body. It changes form, becoming subtler, but it does not break. The soul feels this love regardless of how many candles are lit or how many tears are shed. A sincere prayer, quietly spoken in the heart, can mean more to the soul than the most lavish ceremony without true feeling." For those who feel guilty about their grief, not meeting societal expectations, it is essential to remember, everyone goes through their own path of mourning, and each soul likely perceives this path in its own way. There is no right or wrong way to maintain a connection with departed loved ones. Perhaps instead of worrying about how loudly we express our sorrow, we should focus on the quality of those moments when we remember the departed. Talk to them in your heart, share joys and sorrows, and continue to include them in your life in ways that feel natural to you. And remember that if souls can indeed watch over us after they leave, what they likely cherish most is not our grief, but our striving to live a full life filled with love and meaning. As Mercedes, an elderly woman from Argentina who has lost many loved ones, said, "I believe they want to see me happy. The best way to honor their memory is to live so that they are not ashamed of me." The feeling of loss is the price we pay for love. But love itself does not die with the body. It continues to exist as a bridge between worlds, as an invisible thread that connects souls, regardless of the dimension they inhabit. And perhaps it is this thread, rather than external manifestations of grief, that truly matters for those who have left this world, but continue to live in our memories and hearts. To conclude, we would like to thank everyone who is with us today in this reflection on what the souls of our departed loved ones feel. We hope that these thoughts have brought you some comfort and a new perspective on the process of grief. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us create more content on topics that touch the deepest strings of the soul. Don't forget to also like and share this video with those who might need it in a difficult moment. Leave your thoughts and stories in the comments. We appreciate each of your responses. Until we meet again in the next episodes.